It's just before dawn in the Kent countryside, and the heat is already pressing down. England is in the grip of a historic heat wave, but that's not why the rangers are moving fast. In a corral near Canterbury, 3 bison, massive, ancient-eyed, unhurried, are about to walk into a British forest for the first time in 6,000 years. No wild bison have set foot on this island since before the pyramids were built. And in a few minutes, that's about to change. The reason for the early hour isn't ceremony, it's survival. Rangers need these animals to reach the shade of the woods before the sun climbs and the temperature becomes dangerous. Everything about this release has been calculated. The timing, the fencing, the tunnels built beneath footpaths so half-ton animals can cross safely through one of the most crowded corners of England. And yet, for all that planning, no one really knows what happens next. Can 3 females, raised in wildlife parks with fences and feeding schedules, remember how to be wild? My name is Ranger Emily. I've spent much of my career watching landscapes change, sometimes by human hand. If stories like this move you, I'd love for you to like this video and subscribe. There are more of them ahead. Because to understand why these 3 particular animals matter so much, we need to go back to the forest they were about to change, and the 6,000 years of silence that came before them. Walk into Blean Woods today, before the bison, and you'll notice something strange about the silence. Rows of commercial pines stand shoulder to shoulder, planted for timber, not for life. The canopy closes so tightly overhead that almost no light reaches the ground. Underneath, the forest floor is bare. No wildflowers, no young saplings, no thick tangle of undergrowth for insects to shelter in. It's a forest in shape only. This is not unique to Kent. The UK is now ranked among the most nature-depleted countries on Earth. Its wildlife populations diminished after centuries of land management built around human convenience rather than ecological function. We planted trees in straight lines. We cleared undergrowth for access. We managed woodlands the way you might manage a filing cabinet, orderly, efficient, and almost entirely lifeless. For decades, the assumption was that better tools, better planning, could fix this. Thin the trees mechanically, clear brush on a schedule, manage from above. And yet, the decline continued anyway. Here's what conservationists have come to understand. A chainsaw can open a gap in the canopy, but it cannot replicate what a half-ton animal does by simply existing in a landscape. The unpredictable trails, the bark stripped at odd angles, the dust wallows scattered without pattern. Nature doesn't organize itself in straight lines. It needs disorder, chosen not by a management plan, but by an animal following instinct. Long before pine plantations, before fences and forestry schedules, this exact landscape had its own architect, a colossal, shaggy engineer that shaped British woodland for tens of thousands of years. Then, one day, it simply vanished. And for 6,000 years, nothing has replaced it. A century ago, that ancient engineer had nowhere left to stand. By the early 1900s, the European bison, the last close relative of the vanished woodland giants that once shaped this island, had been hunted and pushed out of every wild forest on the continent. Not reduced, not endangered, gone. Extinct in the wild entirely. What remained existed only behind bars. Scattered across a handful of European zoos, the entire future of the species came down to 12 animals. 12. Not 12 herds, not 12 populations. 12 individuals, carrying within them the only genetic thread connecting the modern world to an animal that had shaped European landscapes since the last ice age. It's hard to overstate how fragile that moment was. A disease outbreak, a hard winter, a single bad decade of poor breeding management. Any of it could have erased the species permanently. And with such a narrow genetic base, there was a real question haunting conservationists for decades afterward. Even if the population recovered in number, Would it still carry the instincts that made a bison? Or would generations spent behind fences, fed by hand, slowly breed the wildness out of them? Slowly, carefully. The population did grow. Today, there are roughly 7,000 European bison alive. Every single one descended from those original 12. The species remains classified as near threatened, a reminder of how narrow that escape truly was. But genetic research offered something remarkable. Despite the bottleneck, despite generations in captivity, the European bison proved to be almost genetically identical to the extinct woodland bison that once roamed Britain. The instincts hadn't vanished, they'd simply been waiting, which meant the ark was finally ready. The only question left was whether anyone would be bold enough to open it and gamble over £1 million on animals that hadn't seen a British forest in 6,000 years. The gamble had a name, Wilder Bleen, and it had a price tag, £1.1 million, funded by the People's Postcode Lottery, backing an idea that ran against almost everything modern land management believed in. Instead of spending that money on machinery, on foresters, on managed clearance schedules, Kent Wildlife Trust and Wildwood Trust chose to spend it on infrastructure built for absence, fences, tunnels, and collars designed to let humans step back, not forward. The engineering alone tells you how seriously they took the risk. 2 fences, one of them electrified, ring the release site. Custom tunnels were built beneath existing footpaths, sized precisely for an animal that can weigh half a ton, so bison and walkers would never have to cross paths directly. This is one of the most densely populated corners of England. There was no margin for error. But fences only solve half the problem. The harder question was social, not structural. The 3 founding females didn't know each other. They arrived from different countries, different enclosures, different lives. An older female from the Highland Wildlife Park in Scotland, and 2 younger females from Photo Wildlife Park in Ireland. Strangers, suddenly expected to function as a herd. Rangers had seen this kind of introduction go wrong elsewhere. It was part of why the team studied the Kransvlak project in the Netherlands beforehand, where more than a dozen bison have lived alongside walking trails for years without a single dangerous incident. Proof that it could work if the social structure held. It held. Almost immediately, the older Scottish female settled into the role of matriarch, calm, unbothered, quietly directing the younger animals as they explored their first 5-hectare enclosure. Ranger Donovan Wright would later say they couldn't have asked for a better leader. The herd was unified, stable, calm. Now came the real test. Not whether they could get along with each other, but whether they could remember, after generations in captivity, exactly what to do with a forest. They didn't need to be taught anything. Within weeks of settling into their enclosure, the females began doing things no ranger had trained them to do, things no wildlife park had ever given them room to do. They leaned their weight into targeted trees, stripping bark in long ribbons. They dropped to the ground and rolled, carving out wide dust baths in the earth. They pushed through undergrowth, not randomly, but with purpose, creating trails that hadn't existed a month before. Each female wore a tracking collar fitted the day before release, and the data those collars produced told a quiet but remarkable story. You could plot their movements against a map of the forest and watch a pattern emerge. Not the neat lines of human forestry, but something older and messier. Irregular clearings, broken canopy, trails that curved around obstacles rather than through them. The rangers had a phrase for what the bison were doing as they moved. Acting like a giant seed bank. Every plant they brushed against, every seed caught in fur or hoof, traveled with them and was deposited somewhere new along their route. Dispersal, without a single human hand involved. And the forest floor answered. Where sunlight had been blocked out for years by dense pine canopy, it began reaching the ground again. Ground-level photography from those first weeks shows the difference plainly. Dark, sterile understory, giving way to patches of exposed earth and early growth. Fungi appeared, insects followed, lizards found new basking ground in the open patches, birds and bats began using the reshaped edges of the woodland. 3 animals, a few weeks, a commercial forest, quietly being rewritten from the ground up. What happened next didn't stay contained to Kent. It couldn't, because if it worked here, in one of the most crowded landscapes in England, there was no reason it couldn't work somewhere far larger and far to the north. The success in Kent led to something the original team may not have fully anticipated when they released 3 cautious females into a 5-hectare enclosure. Herds now establish themselves in Cumbria's Solway wildlands, hundreds of miles north, joined by Exmoor ponies and Iron Age pigs, each species doing its own small part to shape a landscape without a single management plan behind it. A local experiment became a working template. What strikes me most, looking back over this story, isn't the speed of the transformation. It's what that speed reveals. These animals carried instructions inside them the entire time. Instructions that generations of fences and feeding schedules couldn't erase. We didn't teach the bison how to restore a forest. We simply stopped standing in the way long enough to let them remember. That's a harder lesson than it sounds. Most conservation work is built around control. Manage the land, manage the species, manage the outcome. Wilder-Bleen suggests something quieter and more difficult, that some of the best solutions available to us aren't things we need to build. They're things we need to release and then trust. I keep coming back to one image from this story, not the heat wave, not the fences, not the funding meetings. Just a bison, alone in a shaft of new sunlight that hadn't touched that particular patch of ground in years, rolling in the dust, indifferent to the cameras, indifferent to the 6,000 years that had passed since the last of its kind stood in that exact spot. It raises a question worth sitting with. How many other landscapes are we still managing by hand, when the right animal, given room, could do the work far better than we ever could? If you found value in this story, I'd encourage you to subscribe. There are other conservation journeys like this one worth exploring together. Nature rarely needs saving in the way we imagine. Sometimes it only needs an invitation and the patience to wait for the answer.